In 1949, oil geologist Dr. M. King Hubbert developed the theory of oil depletion, making the prediction that the fossil fuel era would be very short. In 1956, he forecasted that American oil production in the continental 48 states would reach peak production in 1970. Production did peak that year, as he predicted. In 1974, Hubbert testified to a Senate subcommittee warning of the dangers of declining fossil fuels in an exponential growth culture. President Carter formed a task force which in 1980 published the Global 2000 Report to the President. The report pointed out that by the year 2000, half of all the oil available in the world would have been consumed. Carter had begun a new energy policy. Tax credits were offered for alternative energy, and wind turbines began to appear on the landscape. But then Alaska's Prudhoe Bay and the oil fields of the North Sea came online. The oil crisis eased and prices dropped. Carter's call for frugality and care was rejected. Ronald Reagan moved into the White House and dramatically cut research and development for alternative energy. It was morning in America again, and the country went to sleep for a generation. The long sleep of the 80s and 90s is coming to an end, and with no more preparation than in 1970, global peak oil is arriving. The effect on our culture could be extreme. Our economy and our way of life are based on consuming oil and other fossil fuels. Each person in the U.S. consumes the yearly per capita equivalent of 10 barrels of oil for food, 9 barrels of oil for automobiles, and 7 barrels of oil for their homes. The major use of fossil fuels is for food production.
We're going to be in a situation where this thing that we have disregarded so far, food, because it's plenty food in the supermarket, is going to be scarce.
What peak oil means is essentially a limited supply. World oil discovery peaked in the mid-1960s and has been declining ever since. Right now we're consuming about 5 barrels of oil for every one that we discover. That is an unsustainable amount and can't be continued much longer. But at the same time, we have increasing demand throughout the world, especially in developing countries like China.
Now, in 1993, China had 733,000 cars on the road, and by the start of 2004, they had 6 million cars. By the end of 2004, they had 8 million cars. They've convinced people that it's nice to drive.
Well, the whole vision for these developing countries is that they're going to be like America someday, and that the people are going to be able to consume the way that Americans have consumed. But that's not going to be able to happen. And that's not even possible for America. Americans won't be able to consume like Americans today.
Over the last 150 years, we've created a society that runs on oil. And it's inevitable that we would have done so, because it's just such incredibly inexpensive, convenient, energy-dense stuff.
I spoke with Richard Heinberg, a core faculty member of New College of California and author of 3 books on peak oil.
The problem, of course, is that oil is a non-renewable resource. So even when we first started using the stuff, we knew that eventually we'd run out.
I met with the journalist Paul Roberts, who wrote a book about oil depletion in 2004.
At some point, since oil is a finite resource, you can't keep raising production. Usually this is about the halfway point. When you've depleted half of the resource, it becomes harder and harder to raise production. It doesn't mean you run out, and a great deal of oil is still coming out of the ground. If we were to peak tomorrow, we'd still have 82.5 million barrels coming out of the ground every day, but it would be really hard to get 83.5 million barrels.
We have raised globally in our atmosphere the concentration of carbon dioxide from about 280 parts per million in the late 1800s to close to 380 parts per million today. That's roughly a 30% increase, and the projection is that we'll be 550, 560 in the year 2050.
Schlesinger's colleague at Duke, Professor of Conservation Ecology Stuart Pym, added this.
There is now a strong scientific consensus that has caused warming over the last several decades.
So, greenhouse gases on the rise. Temperature on the rise, more floods, more droughts, rising sea level. It's been in the news for some time now.
Crops and trees will grow in places they don't grow today. We have a lot of suspicion that they may not grow as well.
And we're beginning to see extinctions of species that have literally no place else to go as the climate gets warmer.
The amount of carbon dioxide that we're putting out into the atmosphere is rising to a point now where most scientists would agree that we may be at a sort of tipping point. We may be at a point where we're going to start to get so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that feedback mechanisms that control the temperature of the Earth will start to be stretched a little bit too far. The classic one is you get too much melting of ice, it flows into the ocean, and you shut off the conveyor belt. And if that happens, this will cause dramatic changes in the climate in England. I mean, England would literally become Norway or Sweden if you look at them on the globe.
This is why I tend to use the term climate change rather than global warming. A warming planet can have heating and drought in some areas and freezing in others, such as Europe and North America would experience if the Gulf Stream shut down. The impact of that would be huge.
Those portions, much of which supply the agricultural bounty for Europe and the U.S., would have dramatic changes in climate, particularly affecting agriculture.
In the Himalayas, there's a particular problem because 40% of all the people in the world get their drinking water from rivers and spring systems that are fed more than half by the meltwater coming off the glaciers. And within this next half century, those 40% of the people on Earth are going to face a very serious shortage because of this melting. And this is also a political issue. This is a computer map of the world that distorts to show the relative contributions to global warming. In our country, we are responsible for more than all of South America, all of Africa, all of the Middle East, all of Asia, all combined. The per capita average in Africa, India, China, Japan, EU, Russia, there's where we are, way, way above everyone else. If you take population into account, it's a little bit different. China's playing a bigger role, so is Europe, but we are still, by all odds, the largest contributor.
We can take a lot of punches. Nature takes punches pretty readily. Global warming is a really severe punch. And all that we depend on for natural systems and agricultural systems is about to be wiped out pretty drastically.
About to be? What is he saying? Do we dare speak of such disasters as inevitable? If we speak of inevitability, will that overwhelm people? Will they slide into apathy and diversion? Isn't that where people already are? If we don't look at these things, one thing seems certain.
Generations to come are not going to be very happy with us for refusing to get serious about these hugely important issues.
Maybe it's just too big to do anything about. And you know, there are a lot of people who go straight from denial to despair without pausing on the intermediate step of actually doing something about the problem. And that's what I'd like to finish with, the fact that we already know everything we need to know to effectively address this problem. We got to do a lot of things, not just one. If we use more efficient electricity appliances, we can save this much off of the global warming pollution that would otherwise be put into the atmosphere. If we use other end-use efficiency, this much. If we have higher mileage cars, this much. And all these begin to add up. Other transport efficiency, renewable technology, carbon capture and sequestration, a big solution that you're going to be hearing a lot more about. They all add up, and pretty soon we are below our 1970 emissions. We have everything we need, save perhaps political will. But you know what? In America, political will is a renewable resource. We have the ability to do this.
Each one of us is a cause of global warming, but each of us can make choices to change that.
With the things we buy, the electricity we use, the cars we drive, we can make choices to bring our individual carbon emissions to zero.